Hello, this is John Stanford, your host of the Making Medicine podcast. We're thrilled to have Dr. Henry Skinner, CEO of the AMR Action Fund, with us today to talk about what else? AMR, antimicrobial resistance, and the great work the fund is doing to solve one of the great healthcare challenges of the 21st century. Dr. Skinner was an obvious choice to lead the fund and a fit for our investor-focused podcast, given his tenure at Tekla Capital Management, as well as managing director of Novartis' venture fund. Dr. Skinner, welcome to the show.
Thank you, John, and thank you for having me and putting on these podcasts. They're a great compliment and allow all of us to gain a little more knowledge along the way.
Well, and I think a lot of folks will benefit from today's conversation. And so let's level set for everyone in the audience. We're going to be talking about an acronym all day. Wouldn't be Washington if there weren't an acronym. So AMR, or antimicrobial resistance. Can you give everyone out there a quick 101 primer of what is AMR and why is it so relevant today?
Absolutely. AMR is incredibly relevant today, but at the simplest, antimicrobial resistance is a natural process by which pathogens develop resistance to antibiotics that we've developed in the past. We need to remember bacteria and fungi have been fighting with each other for over 4 billion years. And our antibiotics have been derived from natural products. In other words, the ability of bacteria to fight each other. So this tension has been in nature for billions of years, and it's only been the last 100 years or so that we've tapped nature to develop antibiotics. And starting in the 1920s with the discovery of penicillin by Fleming, we had a golden age of antibiotics with many tens of them developed amongst a number of classes. But each time we develop a new antibiotic, the bacteria are exposed to it and through natural selection develop resistance. And we need to develop and use a different antibiotic for resistant bacteria or fungi. And this is AMR at its core. So since the 1920s, as we brought penicillin to the market during World War II and saved countless millions of lives, resistance has developed to that, aminoglycosides, carbapenems, and other classes of antibiotics. And over time, although the antibiotics work well most of the time, some of these pathogens that are resistant become increasingly difficult to treat, sometimes impossible to treat if they're resistant to all antibiotics. And that's the situation we find ourselves today. So when we talk about AMR, it could be a pathogen resistant to one antibiotic, or in the worst case, to all antibiotics, which means a simple infection becomes life-threatening again, as it was in the early 1900s and before.
I think that's really kind of makes you feel humanity's role a little small. These things have been battling for, like you said, billions of years. Enter us only 100 years ago using science to combat this. And a theme that seems to come out of it is we're going to need constant innovation. We don't just say, oh, we figured this out. And I think a lot of us on the lay side as patients, when we take these antibiotics, we're glad to have them, amoxicillin or whatever, the bacteria is going to go away, I'm going to be great. And I think that's why we have to get the word out that it's great when it works, but we have an enemy that we are constantly battling, and it is constantly adapting. So we have this great threat, and it certainly is a great threat. I've heard a lot of folks, yourself included, really declare it as one of the great threats to the health of humanity in the 21st century. So enter the AMR Action Fund, which you lead. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is, what it's doing, and why it was a necessary step in addressing this problem that you sort of described?
Absolutely. So the AMR Action Fund came about through a collaboration between the World Health Organization, IFPMA, biopharma, pharmaceutical companies, the Wellcome Trust, and others, who recognized that there was a decline in the investment in innovation in antibiotics, and that biotechnology companies, which, as we know, across healthcare, drive innovation and I don't know, maybe 80% of it, and certainly in the antibiotic space, the vast majority of the innovation is driven by small and medium-sized companies. But the absence of funding going into that has I don't know, accelerated or decelerated, depending on how you want to look at it. The dearth of funding has created fundamental gaps in moving that innovation forward, and bringing new products to market. Recognizing that gap, this group came about and said, we need to do something about that. And so $1 billion was dedicated to the fund and pledged to it that we will invest over the next 10 years. So, 100 plus million a year over that period of time to drive the innovation forward, to maintain the pipeline and bring 2 to 4 new antibiotics to the marketplace to treat the most urgent drug-resistant infections across the world. So that's the genesis of the fund. Now, the reason why we have to have the fund, unlike other areas of healthcare, because if you look at investment into healthcare over the last 20 years, we've really seen an enormous amount of capital made available through private and public markets, venture capital firms, hedge funds, PE, and the public markets over the last decade or two that has driven enormous investment and enormous patient benefit through a remarkable set of products that are helping patients across the spectrum, right? From cancer, we've seen dramatic innovation and patient benefit to genetic diseases, ophthalmology, arthritis, you name it, right? We've seen really what the power of innovation and scientists can do when they have the capital freed up to do it. But while investment has come into the field generally, it's been starved in the field of AMR or new antibiotics. And if you look over, I don't know, I think that the last numbers I've seen, maybe these are 1918, 19 numbers, over the last decade, we had roughly $27 billion invested into innovations in oncology by small companies. The amount invested in AMR, about 160 million or so a year. So, we're talking maybe 1/40th, so maybe 2.5% of what's been invested just in oncology in this. Yet antibiotics is probably the most successful class of drugs from the standpoint of patient benefit and improving outcomes of any class. And frankly, it enables our healthcare system overall. So if we go back to where we were in the 1920s and 10s, the simplest of surgery and a simple infection, killed millions of people. I've seen quotes of estimates that the development of antibiotics starting in 1920s and 30s has added approximately 10 years to the life expectancy of people, right? So a huge benefit to society. And yet it has so little investment now. And the fundamental reason for that is antibiotics are a very unique class of molecules from the standpoint of how we use them in the clinic. They're incredibly effective. We typically give them from anywhere from 7 to 14 days. So you treat, you cure the infection, and I'm sure we've all had scripts for 10 days or so, and you're cured, right? And you go on to have a productive life, and you don't even think twice about it. We've taken this for granted. Unlike other chronic diseases where you have to take that medicine for the rest of your life sometimes, think insulin, for example. So that's one dimension, which means that these drugs are used for a short amount of time. And in our system, we tend to put value on drugs that is intimately tied with the volume of the drug that's used, right? So we want to bring benefit to all patients, and the more of the drug that's used, the more patients that benefit, and the more revenue that comes from that innovation to reward the innovators and the companies that have invested in that development. In antibiotics, it's really a different mix. We want to use these drugs sparingly. We've got a number of them, and we want to give the right antibiotic to each and every patient each and every time. But we don't want to misuse these. The more we use antibiotics, the more resistance develops, and therefore that drug becomes of limited use. Furthermore, as resistance develops, it spreads. So unlike resistance that you might find in oncology, and then you move on to your second line therapy, in antibiotics, right, this resistant pathogen can then spread to other people and actually exacerbate the problem more generally. And so you put all these things together, and it really means that the market for antibiotics needs to be different than a volume driven reward because we don't want to abuse and overuse these new antibiotics and then limit their utility in the long run. So, because of these things and a few other things with DRGs and how antibiotics are actually paid for in the system, the new antibiotics we've developed over the last decade or so have not received the same type of remuneration as other therapies have. And we've seen a number of bankruptcies of companies that have successfully developed antibiotics, companies such as Achaogen and Melinta. And Melinta had 4 approved antibiotics they were commercializing, and yet they went bankrupt. And so you bring these things together, and investors are very logical people. They have duties to the people who give them the money to invest and expect a return, to invest in things that are going to give a return. And you can't invest in a company, take all the scientific risk and the clinical risk, successfully develop an antibiotic, only to have the company go bankrupt and not reward both the entrepreneurs, the scientists, and the investors for that risk. Because of that, we have too little investment, the pipeline's too thin. So the fund was put in place to try to change that. Now, we have $1 billion roughly to invest, but let's be frank, we know it's expensive to develop new drugs. I think we're optimistic we can help bring 2 to 4 new antibiotics to market over the next decade. This isn't enough. We have between the CDC and WHO, I think over 18 identified priority pathogens that are drug resistant that we need to find treatments for. Antibiotics treats, any one antibiotic would treat some of these infections. We have infections of bone, urinary tract, skin, intra-abdominal, lungs with HAP, VAP, etc. We need a mix of drugs that are going to be addressing these various problems. And 2 to 4 is not enough. The pipeline is not rich enough where we are. The fund will contribute to keeping things going, to keeping that pipeline moving forward. We'll try to invest in the best and most meaningful of those drugs. But we're a placeholder, right? We're really going to give function to keep the pipeline going, people engaged here. And that buys us some time as a society, right, to have our policymakers make some changes to the marketplace that brings the natural flow of capital back into this critically important area for healthcare. So that's the fund. And then just a couple words about how we operate. We operate like a typical VC. We are very heavy into diligence of the underlying scientific merits of the programs of the company, the clinical strategy going forward, marrying the product to where the greatest clinical needs are around the world, and then how to prove that. And as most funds, we look at the management team and so forth. And we hope to catalyze other investors coming back into this field by being in it. And I think we've had some success in our first 2 investments there. But first, we will keep the pipeline moving. We'll try to keep the best of those going. It's not enough. We need others to come in, and we need to fix the broken market to have that happen.
Yeah, first of all, that was tremendous. I think you not just outlined what the Action Fund's role is, but this broader concept. And, we had a VC on earlier last year that talked about this market failure. And, you talked about the natural flow of capital. On this show, we always talk about capital flows like water. And it seems in the AMR space, we got a big rock right in the middle of the stream that is diverting this capital. And that is this market failure, this reality that in our market system, volume and value do go hand in hand, and yet we need people to develop drugs to be used, as you said, sparingly. And so I want to keep pulling at this, sort of addressing this market failure, because your work is great, and $1 billion is a lot, but it's also a little. And I think everyone should be concerned hearing that you have 18 targets and possibly 2 and 4 in the pipeline. So I know there's some discussion about other needed actions and needed actors. And one of the big ones is government. Incubate has been active in supporting something called the Pasteur Act that I know you've had a hand in conversation discussing. Why is government engagement, law, and sort of these pull incentives so critical to addressing this challenge?
Yeah, it is probably the most important thing that we need to address collectively. Again, the marketplace is broken. So if you have a new antibiotic, and let's frame the discussion. So, somewhere between 35 and 50,000 people in the U.S. die every year from AMR, right? So this is not trivial, right? This is a really significant problem. AMR probably cost the healthcare system, 20 billion in direct costs, another 30 in indirect already, right? So the cost is significant. But the challenge is that we live in a system where historically we value drugs based on volume, as you said. Whereas antibiotics, we really need to think of valuing them in a much broader sense. So, treating a person that has a drug-resistant infection with the right drug that does several things, right? It cures the infection in that patient, and so there's enormous benefit to that patient and their family. It also limits the spread of that bacterium, right? We've seen the spread of drug-resistant infections in hospitals around the world. I was just reading of a facility in Michigan that had to shut down because they had a candida infection. I think this is a couple weeks ago, right? So these are real consequences, and you get these infections spreading within the hospital that you can't treat. Not only do those patients suffer and their families, but you need to shut down the ward, you need to sterilize things, and this is just an example of the impact this has. And we've seen with COVID just how perilous our system is, right? Where we've saturated the system with patients, we've run out of beds and ventilators and the like. And having drugs with an infection that limits that further offers a risk to the system. So having the antibiotic that can treat these things prevents all that, right? It keeps our system running efficiently. It allows us to treat patients with chemotherapies that make us more vulnerable to infection. It allows us to treat an aging population, and we know as we age, our immune system becomes less effective, vaccines become less effective, we're more susceptible. And so having the right drug to treat these infections benefits society as a whole. The patients we're treating, the patients we don't have to treat because we've treated successfully these infections, and that propagates over time. So the value antibiotics bring transcends the initial patient that benefits and benefits the system overall. Again, antibiotics have added perhaps 10 years to life expectancy. There's huge value in these treatments. So we need to break out of this mindset that fits other forms of pharmaceuticals, right? If you have a new arthritis drug, you want to give that to everyone who can benefit. With an antibiotic, you don't want to give it to someone who might benefit, right? So if you come in with sinusitis or runny nose, that's probably viral. Truth is, you should not get an antibiotic unless you know there's a bacterial infection, because that drives resistance. If you have a bacterial infection, let's give an antibiotic that will treat that effectively. So we end up in this situation that the world of yesterday of how we looked at value doesn't apply to this unique field, and we need another way to do it. So the other aspect is, if you think about antibiotics, think about penicillin, right? Discovered in 1928. They figured out how to manufacture it during World War II, and it saved countless millions of lives. We still use penicillin today and derivatives from that, right? So we've had now approaching 100 years of benefit to humanity from that invention, right? Then we all know that the cost that we pay for an antibiotic at the pharmacy is usually pretty darn low, which is fantastic, right? This is, in the long run, what we want. We just need the right set of arrows in the quiver to be able to treat all these infections and benefit humanity for the next 200 years or more. So what the pull incentives do is they begin to provide that separation. The things such as the Pasteur Act, the United Kingdom has done something similar, where they have a subscription model where they will say, if you develop a drug that meets these critical clinical needs, we will promise to buy access to that drug, and we'll pay you up to £10 million. And for that, England gets access to the drug for all the patients who need it. Now, you reserve it to just those patients who need it, but you guarantee its availability. If we think about extending that concept, which in Pasteur is similar in the US, to the world broadly, the G7, the G20, we do several things, right? We ensure a pipeline of these drugs that we need. That takes 10, 12, 15 years to develop. And we make them available to patients, and we give physicians the choice based on their clinical guidance and what they need to do to treat the patients, to treat them with the right antibiotic that is separated from other considerations and only focused on the best interest of the patient. So Pasteur, the UK subscription model, and things like that accomplish that. They recognize the value that antibiotics bring to the system that enable chemotherapy, organ transplantation, basic surgery, to be recognized, and to make sure we have the tools so physicians can treat these infections. And the 35, 50,000 deaths in the US can be reduced. It's about 1.27 million people die from AMR around the world. That number is projected to grow to 10 million by 2050, which is less than 30 years away. So we're talking significant consequences if we don't stay ahead of resistance, which is always building, and the bacteria are always looking for a way around our treatments. So if when we get these things accomplished, now we have a marketplace. Pasteur, at least as it's drafted now, would provide somewhere between 750 million to 3 billion, depending on the qualities of the drug that's brought forward to guarantee access, and that's over 10 years. And the beauty of this to me is the pull incentives. You pay for success, right? You let the market do what the market does so well, so efficiently, which is figure out where to put the capital to optimize the chances for success. And when it's successful, you guarantee there's a market, which keeps investment coming in. So now you have a positive feedback loop, and we keep the pipeline alive. The other thing we remember with some of these proposals is that if we don't do it, where will we be in 10 years or 20 years? And we have been so fortunate, with the mRNA vaccines coming after COVID, that we had a vaccine less than a year after COVID was discovered. We would not have had that had we not invested over decades into the underlying technologies that were ready at that moment in time, right? So it takes a lot of investment, a lot of time, a lot of risk taken to be in the position to take advantage of it. It takes a decade, 12, 15 years to develop a new antibiotic. If we don't keep ahead of it, right, this wave or the tide that's been coming to shore, much like global warming, right, is going to hit the shore, and it's going to begin flooding the coastline, so to speak. We need to stay ahead of it. We need to build on the infrastructure we have. And frankly, we need to leverage the great scientific talent, the innovation we have in healthcare, and the scientists we have and the knowledge we have to continue to invest in the space, to have that robust pipeline that allows us to have a continuation of new antibiotics available to treat these incredibly difficult to treat infections.
I was having a conversation the other day with a buddy of mine who's found himself at the Department of Defense, and there is our bio-national security is an element of this as well, is that these pervasive threats need to be addressed for sort of to preserve the American life. I mean, it's tragic that we lose the 35 to 50,000 Americans a year and 1 million people worldwide. But as you said, those numbers are only going to grow. We called this to the Hill a no-brainer in terms of our support for the Pasteur Act. It seems so common sense, and so we'll be working with Congress and hope the policymakers that listen to our show are adding their names to the legislation, and that we can find its way through Congress, because it's a seed that needs to be planted now so that we can yield those returns in the coming years and decade. I want to pause the AMR discussion. I want to come back in a second to talk about some of the exciting news out of the Action Fund. But one of the questions we get most from listeners is to hear more about how people in this fairly niche industry of life science innovation got to where they are. So, could you, I didn't really give much of your background when we kicked this off. Could you walk us through a little bit your journey to find yourself leading the Action Fund and the incredible work you're doing? So, would love to, how did you get where you are today?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I wish I could claim some sort of prescient knowledge about how to get there or some grand strategy. I've been awfully fortunate through my career, and frankly, I think all of us in life science and healthcare today have to look at it that way. If I go back to when I was younger, looking at the healthcare system and where we were and where we are today, the amount of innovation is just incredible. When I started my PhD, I was doing sequencing the old-fashioned way. If I got 60 bases, I felt like I'd really accomplished something. And now we can sequence the genome in hours. And so the transcendent innovation that has really driven so much benefit has been remarkable. So I consider myself fortunate just to live in the time we are to be part of this. But scientist by training, I got a PhD in microbiology. I've always been fascinated by microbes, antibiotics, the story of Fleming and that development. And frankly, seeing the benefit that came from that, right, as it really opened the healthcare system to what we think of today as very simple things and take for granted, right? The ability to have some complex surgeries, to have physicians be able to go in and fix people that need it, be that a broken bone that's gone through the skin, chemotherapy, taking out tumors, etc. If we didn't have antibiotics, these things were impossible. Much like if we didn't have anesthesia, these things would be impossible. But they go hand in hand, and that enablement really has allowed the expansion of healthcare to so much benefit. But coming out of my scientific training, I did a postdoc at Baylor College of Medicine in oncology. And then, again, one of those being in the right place at the right time, the laboratory I was in decided to spin out a company called Lexicon Genetics in Houston. We wanted to knock out every gene in the mouse and understand what it did phenotypically. And then from that, we would understand new targets for human therapeutics and the like. So this is beginning of genomics. This is before the genome was sequenced. And we really had that vision of, boy, if only we knew these things, think of what we could do. And I think in a lot of ways that's come to bear. But I started the company and I was given a choice to be a scientist to move into business development. And I decided to dive in the deep end and do business development, even though I knew how to spell it, and that was about it. But I love that interface between business and science, how you think about growing a company, creating value, developing interactions with big companies, academia, and really thinking of that continuum of innovation and how to apply it ultimately to patient benefit. From there, I was recruited to a company, Pharmacy in Upjohn, based in New Jersey. Ultimately, that became Pharmacy as they bought Monsanto Searle and ultimately got bought by Pfizer. But I did business development for them. I covered all their therapeutic areas. So I got to see that drug discovery and early development across the spectrum. They developed Zyvox while I was there, which is a great antibiotic. I covered neuroscience and cancer, and so I was really able to see a breadth of what it takes to develop a drug and how pharma thinks about it. From there, I went to a couple of young biotechs after Pfizer bought them. I ran a couple of companies as CEO up here in Massachusetts. Sold one of them to Schering-Plough, so I got to see that side of it. And this was a chemistry company, and I'm a biologist, not a chemist, so I think I leave that to smarter people than me. But I look to see what the compounds do in animals and man ultimately. Then I ran an anti-infective company, and I saw firsthand the challenge of trying to finance a company in the space, even back 20 plus years ago, of just how difficult it was and what you needed to do to convince people that, not that we didn't need the drugs, but that the market would be there from them. I then spent 10 plus years at Novartis, most of that in their venture fund, investing in early stage companies, helping to seed companies and take things out of academia. Um, 3 years at Tekla Capital Management, which is a mutual fund, so late stage investment, crossover IPO to public. Um, During that time, I also picked up a Master's of Jurisprudence in Healthcare Law and Policy, as I was intrigued and very interested in the policy side of what we do, not just the scientific and business side. And then the fund was formed, and I can't think of a better place for me to spend the next decade in a more important place. So, a lot of serendipity, started things and learned things along the way, not knowing where it would take me. But, I think the last 20 or 30 years in life sciences has been that way. There's so much opportunity for us and a chance to grab and do some great things to benefit patients.
Well, I think you are representative of probably the dozens of folks who've been on the show. One, in that serendipity plays a big role, but it is this symbiotic and interrelated role of science, business, and now, as you've discovered, policy. And sometimes when I have conversations with policymakers, they don't quite grasp that we have to have all of it. We have to have a suitable policy environment. We happen to be recording this on World IP Day, and so we're having an opportunity to celebrate, Bayh-Dole and the world that created in terms of IP that generates investment. But then it can't just be pure science either. At the end of the day, we live in a world and an economy where we have to justify innovation. And so that blending of scientific minds and business minds, I get asked every once in a while, especially when we're abroad, what's the secret sauce that America has? And it's the blending of those three. And I worry about the unraveling of those three threads, because it really takes a strong business environment, it takes a strong policy environment, and of course, it takes great science. And I think it's fascinating that you've been emblematic of all of that. And as we wrap up, speaking of great science, I just saw some recent good news out of the fund, and saw that you executed your first two deals. Can you share a little bit? Congratulations, by the way. Can you share a little bit about those and anything else in the pipeline that you could talk about?
Yeah, thanks, John. And I think those first two investments are really emblematic of what we're trying to do. Both happen to be U.S. companies. That just happen to be how it is. But we are looking globally for innovation wherever that might be, and we've certainly seen great innovation out of Europe and Asia over the last couple of decades as well. One of the investments is a company called Venatorix. It's been around quite a while. It's what I would call, it's an interesting company in that it started as a platform. It's got a great chemistry platform focused on antibiotics and has a rich pipeline, the most advanced of which just completed its phase 3 studies and showed superiority to comparator, which is really tough to do, especially in this space. It's got a great spectrum of activity. It'll allow us to treat some drug-resistant infections that are extremely difficult to treat with anything else. So this is a drug that's going to matter to patients. So very classic approach. This is a beta-lactam, beta-lactamase inhibitor, of which is a well-proven class, probably the single most important class that we have in our armamentarium. And this is an extension of that history going back to augmentin and other things. So tried and true through phase 3, so late stage. It has a phase 2 program and some earlier things, great chemistry platform, just a really solid company, been around a while. And this looks like it should be its first approval, right? So to my point earlier, it takes about 10 years to, get up and running and to maybe get a product to patients. And congratulations to the team there for that success. It's tough to do, and they've done a great job. Classic approach. The other company we invested in is Adaptive Phage Therapeutics. This is a very different approach. This is using bacteriophages or viruses that infect bacteria Not classic small molecule approach. We have never had a bacteriophage approved. There's lots of challenges from a regulatory manufacturing standpoint. And the approach this company's taken is almost polar opposite of what Venatorix is, which is here's a great drug, we'll use it as we've always used antibiotics. Adaptive phage has taken what I would characterize as a personalized medicine approach. So you have an infection, we test that pathogen against a bank of bacteriophages and find one, two, or three that are going to be effective. And now we have a potent drug to give that patient that should be highly efficacious for that patient is different from all the other mechanisms. So we shouldn't drive cross resistance and resistance. We shouldn't amplify the problems we have. And we're going to treat some very difficult infections there. And they have ongoing studies in prosthetic joint infections, which is a debilitating chronic infection, extremely difficult to treat. Of indwelling devices and knee replacements, hip replacements, shoulders, and the like. So this is what I would call, in some ways, an extremely novel approach. Right, this sort of approach has never been approved, but we think it's a fantastic approach. Complements everything else in the antibiotic space, and gives us another dimension to treating these infections going forward. And I'd say that probably bookends what we're looking to do. Extremely, you could debate how risky it is, but highly innovative approaches that have not yet been proven, to tried and true approaches and improvement on the chemistries and other things in areas that we've have successful products before. So we are taking a holistic view of how to approach the problem, looking for innovation, be it chemistry, or be it brand new modalities, and working with the companies to drive them forward. So this happened to be our first two. We are very active in diligence on others. We are clinically focused, so we're still trying to primarily look at companies that are already in the clinic. But we are engaging and talking with companies that are preclinical. We want to give our advice as to where the need is, as to what we would like to see developed, and be an ideal candidate for future investment in us. So we're looking to do all of that. In addition, we've developed a really top-notch scientific advisory board from around the world of regulatory experts, ID physicians, chemists, and so forth, to help us both understand what we're looking at better, but also to help the companies as they think about how to develop their products. So where's the ideal setting? How do they think about their product profile and optimize it to where the clinical need is? And that discussion could be as detailed as, how do you think about your phase 3 study or phase 2 study? Should it be single arm, 2 doses, high, low, et cetera? So we are looking to be active, not only bring capital in, but really helping companies think through their strategy and develop that, looking at the marketplace and beyond.
Well, I think that leaves it on an optimistic and innovative note. I think, touching on that technical expertise that they need beyond just capital is something we talk a lot about on this show. I love the all of the above approach. And we recently had someone who does a lot of oncology investment on, and they talked about, yes, IO is in vogue, but small molecules coming back in vogue. And that, I think, something we all forget is just how wide the spectrum of possible treatment is. So it's really exciting to hear that your first two investments are at both ends of the spectrum. One thing I know I'm taking away from this is something you said, that our ability to combat bacterial infection is an underpinning that, as you said, enables the entire healthcare system. I had, in fifth grade, a bunch of broken arms. They ended up putting a pin in my system, or in my arm. And not until now am I realizing that very basic surgery that let my arm heal would never have happened if we weren't prepared to address any bacterial infection I may have gotten. And that, we all have that story, and we've all taken an antibiotic. I'll close since I have you, because I can't have a section on antibiotics without maybe raising it's one of everything we hear. If you're prescribed an antibiotic, you're told to take it, all the way to the end, not just till you feel better. Take the antibiotic for the full 7 days, 10 days. Since we have a captive audience, can you maybe just say a couple words of why that is? Because we're all dubious. When we feel better after day 3 of the antibiotic, it sits in the fridge or it sits on the shelf. You know, is it so critical that we take the full 7 day, 10 day regimen?
It is, and the reason's simple. So the beauty is, and I know when my children were young and had an ear infection caused by bacteria, you get amoxicillin or what have you, and they're feeling better within 24 hours, right? Which is just incredible, right? Because how many drugs really make you, from lying on the bed to running around that quickly. But we need to remember, we need to clear that infection, right? We need to wipe out those bacteria that are causing the problem. We feel better pretty quickly because the inflammation is down, we're killing most of the bacteria, but we need to wipe them all out and let our immune system clean it out completely. So if we take a partial course, we've done, 60, 70% of the battle against them, but within that mix, if the body can't clear the infection, we've also set ourselves up for drug-resistant infection. So every time we give an antibiotic, the bacteria are trying to find a way around it. And if we don't take the full course, we give them a chance to find that way around. And taking half the course, we feel better, and then boom, the infection's back, or the inflammation's back, so it's painful again. The infection was never cleared. Now we need to take the antibiotic again, but now it doesn't work because the bacteria learned from that treatment how to get around it. Now we're in trouble, right? So now we have to hope there's another one. You go back to the physician, you get, something else instead of the one you had, and hopefully that works. But, it's a bit of Russian roulette. It's a tough thing. And at some point you become infected with a pan-resistant and there is nothing left. And we're seeing that today in the system. Right? There are patients today dying because we do not have an antibiotic left to treat them. Right? We're back to 1920s where all the physicians can do is watch, and that's not the place to be. But let's also extrapolate that. I mean, so that's taking what you have, and we have the benefit here of having great quality drugs, great quality control in our system. As we look around the world, there's problems with counterfeit drugs, adulterated drugs, drugs that have expired, or if they're counterfeit, who knows what it is? It's certainly not what it's supposed to be. And this problem is, if you think about it around the world, is even much broader than taking your full course. You may think you are, but if it's only half active, we're not. So, but it's absolutely essential, the right drug to the right patient for the right amount of time. And that will, in almost all instances, cure the infection. And that's what it's all about.
Well, I appreciate you indulging me. I think this is as close as we'll ever get to a healthcare PSA on this show. Thank you to Dr. Skinner, the entire team at AMR Action Fund for the great work. If you didn't take away from the show that this is a grave threat, a real threat, and something of consequence to all of us, I encourage you to listen again because that was so clear. Appreciate all of our audience for listening and sharing feedback. More from Incubate and more on AMR more broadly is available at www.incubatecoalition.org. A special thanks, as always, to my colleagues Ashlyn Roberts and Olivia Lucani in the making of today's podcast. I think this was a great episode, so thank you again, Dr. Skinner. And as always, keep innovating.
Thank you very much, John.